What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and if you're enjoying the content that I'm uploading onto my channel, then feel free to subscribe, and you can also offer suggestions on topics and characters and storylines and whatnot that we can have discussions on later on in this channel.
So what we're going to do is we're going to pepper in some of the older Walking Dead stories. And I want to kind of get these in there because I want you guys to have an idea in the comics anyway, the roots of all this stuff, why it grew to be so popular. Not only that, it'll give us a more cohesive playlist. Instead of the playlist just kind of picking up with like volume 17 or whichever one it was that we started on, it'll give us something more cohesive. So we'll literally have all the volumes there. But the coolest thing about, The Walking Dead as it stands right now in the comics is that really volume 1 has a lot of striking similarities with the TV show, but there's also a lot of big differences in the sense that this initially picks up with just like, here in Cynthiana, Kentucky. And that's the coolest thing. I mean, I live in Lexington, but in Cynthiana, it's smaller than we are. And it actually works out in terms of the way that Kirkman plays it out. One, because he's from there. And two, because with it being a small town, a lot of things kind of make sense with Rick Grimes initially waking up. But here it's really just kind of a shootout with a few guys who are freaking out. This isn't really tied, or at least it doesn't seem like it's tied to anything. Instead, it's really just Rick being shot in the line of fire, but that's it. I mean, we don't get this huge drawn out thing like we did in the TV show. It's just he's shot and then he wakes up in the hospital. Now, again, this is cool because what Kirkman does with a lot of this Walking Dead stuff is he leaves it to us to fill in the blanks, right? It's kind of up to us to figure out what happened, how it all went down, that kind of thing. But Rick waking up, going out into the hospital, realizing that he's the only one there is really kind of interesting because again, with the Walking Dead TV show, we got this huge dramatic play out where, Shane went to go see him and then the outbreak happened. Rick had these glimpses where he realized Shane was talking to him and all that kind of good stuff. It doesn't play out that way. Instead, it's Rick just waking up and just seeing like corpses, different things like that. Now, something else here was that in the TV show, there was this whole scenario where Rick went to the cafeteria. He saw that there was a sign that said, don't enter all dead. And he basically just kind of backed away because he saw a few fingers that were sticking out through the hole. In the comics, it's not like that. He opens the door and all he finds are just bodies everywhere. Now, with regards to why it plays out this way, again, Kirkman kind of leaves it to us, but it actually invites itself to be this really interesting situation because you got to think, if there was a zombie outbreak, a lot of people probably took up residence in a cafeteria or barricaded themselves in because we see a lot of people who were being eaten, different things like that, and plus you have to consider like how would they have gotten them in the hospital in the first place. And so we're really left to this really, this extremely gruesome situation where we're kind of left to believe that a lot of people probably took shelter inside the cafeteria, hoping the police or the military would show up or something like that. One of them was probably infected and then it just spread to everybody else. We also have to keep in mind here that in the early days when it comes to things like this, no one really knows how it works. All they know is that there's just a fever. Somebody's sick. Well, when you're in a hospital, everybody's sick. So how do you differentiate between people who have the early onset stages of being a zombie and those people who are just there because they have a really bad cold or they have pneumonia or they have an actual debilitating disease? So it creates a really, really wild situation here. But of course, Rick Grimes kind of being freaked out by everything he sees just sets into absolute panic. And that's what I love so much about this is Kirkman does a really good job of just kind of setting it up like, how would you react in a situation like this? What would your response be? Rick goes out to some vehicles that are in the parking garage. He can't access any of them. The vehicles don't seem to work anyway. And so of course, making his way out, he sees this woman, this kind of half-eaten zombie just laying on the ground. Now, this is why I say Kirkman kind of messes with things because the crazy thing about the Walking Dead comics is Kirkman never gives us a time frame. He never really gives us a timeline. He doesn't say, here's where it all started. It's just Rick Grimes wakes up and there's the zombie plague that's going on. Now, I remember there was, Kirkman was doing an interview about this where he talked about that because that was the one thing everybody wants to know. When does this take place? Does it take place in the early 2000s? Does it take place right now? Does it take place in the future? He's like, I'm not going to answer that question. It's left on you to sort of, pick up the little breadcrumbs that he's dropped here and there and really come to our own conclusions. But with Rick making his way out, of course, he grabs a bicycle and immediately heads back home. But when he gets there, all he really sees is that the place has been completely raided. Wandering into the neighbor's yard, he's hit in the head with a shovel. Now, again, this is where we get into the introduction of Morgan. Now, to be honest with you guys, I kind of like the way the show did this a little bit better. The whole Morgan situation, as dark and dreary as it was, because it was a great way to juxtapose how dark and dreary the situation was with how dark and dreary the environment was. I mean, all they really had were like candles to light the way. When Rick comes to, he says, hey man, what in the heck is going on? The difference here is that Morgan doesn't quite have the same kind of confidence that he had when he was in the TV show. Instead, this Morgan is still very much scared, but he's really more laid back. He's not really like a dark character. Instead, things go really, really fast here. That's what's crazy. That's what throws people off is in the first season, of the Walking Dead TV show, the encounter with Morgan, the whole situation where Rick's talking to him, that spanned over a couple episodes. Here, it's one page and that's it. That's all we get, and so they basically take off to the police station. The reason for that is because it's really kind of Kirkman messing around because it's like, well, maybe Morgan will explain everything that's going on. on. And we kind of expected this great big huge, full page explanation. Here's everything that happened. Instead, he's like, yeah, man, like we lost power or we lost communications with the news, and that's it. We have no idea how this all started. Now, this is why The Walking Dead is so cool. This is one of the reasons why it's so great. It's like, the Dawn of the Dead remake from 2006. We don't know how it starts, and they just die, and we never find out whether it ends or not. Because that's exactly how this would play out. That's exactly how a zombie apocalypse would play out. You would just wake up one morning, and suddenly zombies are eating people. You would, make it as best you could. A time would come when you will probably die, whether it's because of old age, whether it's because you were eaten by a zombie, whatever the case may be, but you would never find out how it ends. And Kirkman plays a really good game with that, because he's like, hey man, they're just in the middle of the zombie apocalypse. Now, of course, they make their way to the Cynthiana police station, and that's also why this works out, because Cynthiana is very, very small. It's a very small city. And so we would have to believe that in major scenarios like this, in major panics like this, everybody takes off to the major cities, everybody loots, they just grab whatever it is that they can get in order to in order to survive. But with Cynthiana, it's such a small town, nobody's gonna loot all the police stations, not to mention, here in Kentucky, everybody's all about guns and God. And so the idea is that everybody already has weapons. They've already got ways to defend themselves. Of course, fat lot of good it did them because they all got turned into zombies. But the fact remains here, it's a situation where it plays out organically. It's not forced. It's not like we sit here and we say, well, that doesn't make any sense. Yeah, everybody would, they would have raided the police station. It plays out in a way that has a whole lot of logic here. And so ultimately, Rick Grimes and Morgan go their own separate ways. They basically split up. But the cool thing about this is they try to stay in contact as best they can. They try to keep with one another, keep things going together, also because of the fact that Rick basically gives him the keys to the car and says, hey man, go ahead and take it if you want. But ultimately it's Rick Grimes that grabs it and really just kind of rides off. Now, of course, from here, we pick up with him being stuck at a gas station. Of course, the fact that he ran out of gas. And again, this also makes sense as well, because we'd have to believe that the gas stations would be they'd be empty almost immediately. And again, what Kirkman does is he gives us this very dark, this very, dreary situation in the sense that there's just cadavers all over the place. And truth be told, when Rick comes across what appears to be a vacant house and he gets inside, he finds people who have just basically undergone ritualistic suicide in the sense that they just really off themselves. Now, of course, this appears to be a home where nobody really turned into zombies, or if they did, that was kind of it. But it's a crazy situation because he finds a horse, really, and grabs this horse and takes it to Atlanta. Now, something that I want you to take note of here is that Morgan didn't tell Rick Grimes, well, the government said everybody should go to Atlanta. Instead, Rick says, well, at least according to Morgan, he says, the government said go to major metropolitan cities, go to major areas, because that's what the government's going to protect. They're going to congregate everybody into a major city. They're going to try to protect it. And Rick Grimes basically responds by saying, well, I have in-laws in Atlanta. So if my family's not here, then it makes sense that my in-law or my family probably went to my in-laws. Now, again, I don't know about you guys, when I was going through the first season and I was like, wow, when I was going through this comic and I was like, wow, they told everybody to go to the major metropolitan cities. That's going to be a bloodbath, because there's no way they can contain all those people who are rushing to all those cities and differentiate between who's infected and who's not. In situations like this, you got to play it pretty cold-hearted. You got to say, hey, look, you got to fend for yourself. Best of luck to you, but you got to kind of fend on your own, because once you start letting people in, eventually you'll let infected people in. And when you let infected people in, then you might as well put a bullet to your head and call it a day, because there's no way you're going to be able to stop that infection from breaking out when you've got millions of people congregated into one location. But what Kirkman also does is he appeals to the human side of us. He says, hey, look, these people want to live. They have a right to life. They have the right to live. They have the right to stay alive. And because of that, they're all going to go to the safest place. They're all going to go to the safest location that they perceive to be, which is wherever it is that they can find tanks and they can find, soldiers with automatic guns, all these crazy things. But when Rick gets into Atlanta, it's exactly what we would expect. It's absolute pandemonium. Now, this is where we get into the introduction of Glenn. I know a lot of you guys love Glenn, but here's the crazy thing. Here's the funniest thing about this. You guys remember just as well as I do, with the whole introduction of Glenn, it was like a 3 or 4 issue or 4 episode drawn out thing where it was him, going along with Glenn and trying to figure out where his family was. It doesn't play out that way. Instead, while these zombies are eating his horses, he basically shoots at them and runs for the hills. He doesn't take up residence in a tank or anything like that. Instead, as he's running, Glenn immediately catches him and says, stop using your gun. You're going to draw attention. Follow me. We'll find a way out of here. And of course, they basically take to the rooftops, start jumping from building to building, and eventually make their way out. But what Glenn basically says is, hey, look, Atlanta's a bloodbath, man. That city crashed quick, fast, and in a hurry. And that's what's cool about this, is because Kirkman puts us in a situation where our question would be, well, if Atlanta fell that fast, then what about a place like Los Angeles? What about a place like Seattle or New York or something along those lines? Especially New York, where it's so densely populated. Like, what do you do in a situation like that? Because it's essentially an island, which means you have to take bridges to get off. If the city goes into pandemonium like that. Everybody's driving, everybody's trying to get away. Truth be told, a rural place of the countryside is where you would want to be in an outbreak. But again, Rick almost immediately, it's almost right off the bat, he and Glenn make it out. Glenn says, look, we all took up residence outside of Atlanta on the countryside. We're just hoping the government shows up. And that's it. And then Rick finds his family. It's it's super fast. And I imagine a lot of you guys are kind of like, really, that quick? He found his family that quick? Between the couple of issues that we ran over so far, hell, that's half the season, half the first season. So it's crazy, when you sit down, because when people were making The Walking Dead, they couldn't do it comic by comic, because if they had, it would have been a 5-episode long season, and that would have been it. But when Rick gets there, it's this encampment very much like the one that we saw at the beginning of the season, but there are a few differences that I want to draw here. The first is, of course, we have a woman named Donna. Now, Amy and Andrea are there, but Andrea's not like a hard ass. She's not gung-ho. And that's one of the coolest things. Her character starts out very much like Carol, not in the sense that she is a victim of an abusive relationship, but in the sense that she's very meek. She's very mild-mannered. She's not, extremely gung-ho. She's not really abrasive. Instead, she's very chill. She's very relaxed. It still hasn't quite sunk in that, like, the end is nigh. Instead, they're still very much looking to the future, which makes sense. Nobody wants to walk out into a zombie apocalypse and say, well, it's been real, guys. This is the end of the world. Everybody wants hope. Everybody wants to look to the future and believe that things are going to get better. Otherwise, you really just kind of find yourself giving up. But the reason why Donna is important is because she has twin boys. They are basically, in the TV show, the girls, the two daughters, are the stand-in for the twin boys, but their situation unfolds very much the same way. But the fact remains here, Rick being reunited with his family is again, a lot like what we saw in the TV show, in the sense that it's like, yeah, he's finally found his peace. Not only that, Shane was the one that brought his family here. He's the one that grabbed Lori, the one that grabbed Carl and said, come on, let's go. We got to get out of here. And they basically had to leave Rick behind. Now, something else that I also want you to take note of here is the way that Carol's depicted in the comics. Carol is nothing like she is in the TV show. It's insane how different she is. You couldn't find two people who were starkly different. To be honest with you guys, Andrea, the way that she becomes in the comics is really, in the TV show, kind of split into two people. It's Carol and it's Sasha. It's really interesting the way her character plays out. They kind of eliminated, that idea. But the other person that I hope the other two people that I hope you notice are missing here are Merle and Daryl. Now, I gotta be honest with you guys. Daryl is one of my favorite characters in the entirety of the TV show. But the idea that the way he's depicted is crazy, because we don't see him here. Instead, we really just have Rick and we have Shane going out and really just kind of hunting, foraging for food, taking out whatever zombies happen to be around there. Now, the reason for this is because Shane was really like the muscle in the group, right? Every group has that. Whenever you have some kind of post-apocalyptic situation, you always have the guy who's like the wise old man, the Yoda of the situation. That would come in the form of Dale in a lot of ways. You have the people who do what they can to contribute as best they can. That's basically everybody else. And then you have the muscle, the one that looks out, the one that's like, I do what needs to be done, even if other people don't really like it. In the end, it benefits us. That's Shane. Now, when it came to the return of Rick, what this does is create some pretty big rifts within the camp itself. And the reason for this is because of the fact that, remember, Shane got them out of there. Shane was the one that brought them back to safety. But when Rick shows up, Lori immediately leaves Shane behind and she runs back to Rick. Now, this created some really funny situations when it came to the TV show. And the reason for this is because the concept of loyalty. A lot of people would have looked at Lori and said, yeah, it made sense. She found out her husband was alive. She thought he was dead. Of course she's going to go back to him. On the other hand, Shane was the one that got them out of there. She thought her husband was dead and she was quick to hop in the sack with Shane as soon as she came to the realization that her husband died. So it's like, who does she hold an allegiance to? That was one of the reasons why a lot of people hated her character so much, because she was just bouncing back and forth between the two. It was funny to watch it unfold, because people are like, Lori is the devil. Lori's the devil. I swear to God, I hope she dies. And of course, their wish was granted. From here, in a lot of ways, it's really Rick just, grabbing his bearings in the situation, figuring out what's going on here, how they all come together. And this is when the rift between Shane and Rick really begins to grow. The reason I say this is Shane, as the guy who kept them safe in a lot of different ways, looks at himself not really as the leader per se, but as the guy whose job is now being usurped by Rick Grimes. And the reason is because the first thing Rick does is he gets in and he looks around and says, we have no real measure of protection here, guys. There's no real way for us to protect ourselves. We've got maybe a couple guns, but what we need are more. Like, we need more guns, we need more, we need weapons, we need resources, we need ways to keep ourselves safe. And so what he does is he tells Glenn, we've got to go back into the city, we got to to grab a whole bunch of guns and we got to find a way back. Now, when they get in there, of course, we have, these zombies that are just, kind of all over the place and so on. But they basically go into a gun shop and they loot everything they can. They fight a few zombies along the way. There's not too much to, really to go over here. And then ultimately they make their way back. I mean, there's a little bit of craziness, like, man, are they going to be, are they going to die? Are they going to be injured? But there's a lot of the things that we saw in the first season of the TV show aren't there. There wasn't some gang that had taken up residence in Atlanta, and they were hoarding resources to themselves. Nobody was kidnapped or anything like that. Instead, what we do is we shift our focus over to Shane and Lori. And again, Shane, his world is basically falling apart here because for him, he saw Lori as, well, not really as his wife, but as a significant other in a lot of ways. He saw Carl, as a surrogate son, because in his mind, he was there taking care of them when they needed him. But now that Rick is back, Lori's just super quick to kind of jump off that Shane bandwagon and say, well, no, that night was a mistake. It's only now that Rick is back that the night was a mistake. And she says, well, no, I've got to go back. I got to go back to Rick. I'm sorry, Shane. It's been real. It's been good, but it ain't been real good. And so she basically bails out on him. Now, from here, it's Rick Grimes sitting down with everybody and saying, okay, you guys need to learn how to shoot. And this is where Andrea starts to become a badass. She's one of the best characters in the entirety of the whole comic book, to be honest. And those people who have been reading comics for any measure, or reading the comics for any real measure of time, really since the beginning, will look at her character and say, yeah, she is super badass. She immediately takes to shooting. I mean, she immediately shows right off the bat that she knows how to handle guns extremely well. Not only that, we get some funny things here. I mean, you've got, little Sophia, but you've also got Carl, and Carl wants to learn how to shoot. But of course, Lori's like, no, he does not need to shoot guns. Guns are dangerous. And Rick says, no, he does. He needs to learn how to shoot. He needs to learn how to be responsible with a gun. He needs to learn how to handle a gun. And the reason why is because Rick's facing some situations or some hard truths that Lori may not necessarily be willing to face. Now, it doesn't mean she's bad for not wanting to face these things. It's because of the fact that she's a mom. No parent sits down and says, well, a time's going to come relatively soon when I may very well die, and so my child needs to be prepared. I mean, sure, in a post-apocalyptic landscape, maybe, but most parents want to hold on to their children and keep them as young as possible. They don't want to watch them grow up, but they also want to make sure that they're kept safe. And in the eyes of Lori, she's got Shane, she's got Rick Grimes, everybody else is learning how to shoot. Why does Carl need to learn? And Rick's stance is, we're not going to be here forever. A time will come when maybe we're killed by zombies, maybe we're involved in an accident, maybe we're killed by, rogues, any number of things, but we could very well be killed. And so because of that, Carl needs to be able to hold his own. He needs to be able to shoot effectively so that he can basically defend himself if he needs to. Now, this decision of Rick is of the utmost importance. And the reason why is because there comes a point when Carl is the only reason why Rick remains alive. Now from here, it turns into a really cool bonding situation. Where later on that night, after Rick and Shane and a few others have gone out to gather some firewood, cook some dinner, everybody's really telling their stories. Rick says, hey, look, I don't really know anything about you guys. Tell me about yourselves. It's really everybody getting to know everybody better. Now, this is really, really important. And the reason why is because it's essentially giving everybody a reason to let the others live or to keep the others alive. When it comes to situations like this, people are more likely to care about you if they know about you, if they can identify with you. And so what happens is Dale really tells a story, and he says, he was a salesman for something like 40 years. And, after he retired, he and his wife bought a camper. They've been driving around the country for a couple of years when the whole outbreak started. And so they basically took up residence at a campsite at one point, and his wife never made it out. Now, Dale doesn't actually say what happened to her, but we can basically surmise that she was probably bitten by a zombie and ended up dying. But the fact remains that we switch over to Amy and Andrea, and Amy says, well, Andrea was driving her back to college when the whole outbreak started. Andrea says that she was a clerk at a law firm, and Glenn chimes in and says that he was actually a pizza delivery boy. Now, this is kind of the funny situation is Glenn says he was a college student who was up to his eyeballs in debt, and this zombie apocalypse basically alleviated him of all that debt. The problem is that it alleviated him of everything else that mattered. And so he says, look, I'd gladly go back to living a life where I was up to my eyeballs in debt if it meant that I would have my friends, that I would have my family back. And this is such a human moment for a lot of these characters here. And this is one of the reasons why in the comics we became so attached to them. Because if you were a college student who was swimming up to your eyeballs in debt, you would look at Glenn and say, yeah, man, I could imagine what it's like, but I wouldn't want to lose everything. If you were like Dale and you had retired and you were on the road with your significant other, you wouldn't want to be like, yeah, man, they died in a campsite, when they were killed, because it's like this unglorified death. Like, yeah, she just died in a campsite. When we imagine losing a loved one, we imagine losing them in peace. We imagine that we can put them to rest, that we can say our last goodbyes. We don't imagine that a zombie apocalypse breaks out, they die in a campsite, we got to jump in a camper, hit the road, go to Atlanta and hope for the best. It creates this really wild situation for a lot of these characters because it gives us a chance to better understand them. Now with the story of Carol, this is when the character from the TV show really begins to identify with the character from the comics. The difference here is that, again, they go two separate routes when it comes to how their characters unfolded. But Carol's very similar in the sense that she said that her husband was basically the breadwinner, that he was a used car salesman. The way that she describes him, though, is that in his own mind, at least, her husband considered himself to be a failure. And because he considered himself to be a failure, he took it out on Carol and her daughter. But she doesn't go into details. She doesn't really go into any real measure of explanation. It's just kind of given to us, in terms of the fact that he was a very abusive man. But what she also does is she kind of plays this game where she says, well, he also saw his parents die in front of him. And so, she felt bad for him. She was like, I felt really terrible. But in the end, he more or less took his own life. He couldn't handle the reality of the situation. Now, this is really interesting here because what Kirkman does is he takes this idea that, okay, there are a lot of women out there who are being victimized and they see themselves as victims. They see themselves, well, I can't deal, I can't live without that other guy. There are a lot of people that come from that road. My mom came from that road. But the idea here is that Carol is much tougher than she seems to be because where her husband took the coward's way out, where her husband said, well, I just can't deal with the reality of the situation and he just gave up and shot himself, Carol said, I've got a daughter to take care of. I've got a little girl to take care of. I can't give up because if I give up, who's going to take care of Sophia? And so Carol kept keeping on. She kept going on. And in the end, it led her to Atlanta. And that's the cool thing here is that all these people's roads brought them here. All these people's roads brought them to this location. But while they're having this conversation, while they're having this great, beautiful human moment between each other, of course, Amy gets up to go to the restroom and is immediately attacked by a zombie and is the first casualty of the campsite. Now, the crazy thing about this is that where, Shane and Rick immediately leap into action. They immediately jump in and start, really killing off all these different zombies. Andrea's faced with the reality of the situation that her sister is dying. Now, the issue with this is that Amy does not immediately die. Instead, it's to the point where she's essentially dying. And so the question that Andrea has to ask is, does she let Amy become a zombie or does she kill her? And in the end, she's forced with no other situation than to kill her own sister. In addition to this, we also have Jim. Now, Jim is a guy that we hadn't really talked about before. Again, he was just a mechanic. He doesn't really provide any information here. And the reason why is because he's essentially just a disposable character. But what basically happens is he's one of the people he was bitten by a zombie. He simply says, well, it's just a scratch, but of course there's a huge chunk of his arm missing. And so the idea is that he's going to die. He's going to become a zombie. What they end up doing though is that instead of putting him down, instead of executing him, they allow him to have his peace. They allow him to really die organically. Now, this is a really big deal here. And the reason for this is because of the fact that it's basically Kirkman establishing the fact that these guys are still human, that they're still clinging on to society the way that it used to be. Now, I'd like you to keep this in mind and then think about the discussions that we've had with Negan. Think about the discussions that we've had with, the Whisperers and look at how far they've come, but in some ways, how far they've fallen. In a lot of ways, Rick Grimes and his group have lost their humanity. In a lot of ways, they've lost what it means to be human. They've basically taken the essence of what society used to be and left it behind. Now, some will say that that's a necessity, that, the world has been overrun with zombies. You can't cling to the way things used to be. You have to cling to the way things are now. But it's human nature to want things to go back to normal. It's human nature to want things to be the way they were. The issue with this is that Shane has a lot of deep-seated, anger when it comes to Rick Grimes. The way that he says this is Carl talks about, the death of Amy. He talks about the death of Jim. And Shane just freaks out and says, it's not my fault. Now, this is really him just deflecting what he considers to be fault of his own. When he feels guilty over the idea that he slept with Lori. He feels guilty over the idea that relationship took the turn that it did. But he also sees it as though Rick Grimes is trying to take his place, that he's trying to usurp his position and basically oust him. And so what this is going to do is lead to a confrontation between the two. But in the end, with regards to the character of Jim, when it's faced with the fact that he's going to die, when there's really no room left and there's a day or so before he turns into a zombie, Jim has them, take him out and sit him under a tree and say, just leave me here. I want to be left here. Now, this is a really, really touching moment. And the reason why I say it's such a touching moment is because Jim says, let me stay here. I'll turn into a zombie. I don't want to die. I'll turn into a zombie. And if I do, then maybe I'll find my family. Maybe I'll find, the people that I've lost. And this is such a crazy, sad moment because it's like, he's going to be a zombie, but for him, being reunited with his family is the most important thing. But you can also kind of imagine this desire for him to be united with his family, but instead, he's just some guy roaming around Atlanta, eating whatever it is that he comes across. And so it's a really sad situation, but it's a really interesting situation. Now from here, we pick up with Shane and Rick. And of course, they have to go hunting. They have to find food so that everybody can eat. Rick says, Shane, we need to talk. We need to have a conversation. And the reason for this is because of the fact that Shane has delusions. Shane has issues. The reason why I say this is because once they go out hunting, Shane immediately turns his gun on Rick and he says, I'm gonna kill you, you're going to die. And Rick's response is why? And Shane says, because what's happening right here is not the way things are supposed to be. The government is coming. The government's gonna save us, Rick. The government's coming and the government's gonna save us and everything is gonna be fine. It's Shane basically having a mental breakdown because he can't handle what's going on. And Shane's mind is like, this can't be the end. This can't be the way that all comes crashing down. Now, this is starkly different from Shane in the TV show. And to be honest with you guys, I actually kind of prefer the comic book Shane a little bit more because it's so normal, because it's so reasonable, because it's so grounded, because we could imagine being in this situation. We could imagine being in a zombie apocalypse. We're all just camped out at a campsite somewhere. And there's that one guy who loses his mind because he's convinced that the government's going to come and the government's going to rescue them and the government's going to save them and they're going to have food and they're going to have water and they're going to have beds and everything's going to be okay. They just can't deal with the idea that it's not going to be okay, that there is no government coming from them. You know, that the president may be hiding out in a bunker somewhere, or the president might be dead and he's a zombie roaming around the White House. There's no safe haven. There's nowhere to go. It's just them doing the best they can as long as they can. It's dark and it's brutal and it's hard. But Shane also says everything was perfect before you came here. Everything was okay before you came back. When Rick came back, Lori left Shane. When Rick came back, Lori took Carl and left Shane. If it wasn't for Rick, everything would be fine. And so in his insanity, he turns his gun on Rick Grimes. Carl comes out of nowhere and shoots him through the neck. And that is the death of Shane. And it's such a crushing moment because when we look at Carl in this is why it's so wild. When you look at Carl in this, Carl's crying, he's emotional. Oh my God, I can't believe I shot him. When you look at Carl in the more recent videos that we've done, he's been like, yeah, I shot him and I'll do it again. Like it's so crazy how the characters change. It's so crazy how they grow. But that's why I wanted to cover this, because I wanted you guys to see where they came from. I wanted you guys to see how they were when they first popped up. And I want you to be able to juxtapose that with how they are now and see how far they've fallen, see how far they've gone, see how the experiences with the governor, with cannibals, with Negan, with the Whispers, how it's all changed them, how they learned that there's a greater world out there, but not all of it's better, that there are just some people out there who are roaming around and they're just terrible. But if you guys are new here to Comics Explain and you guys enjoyed this video, make sure you hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. And if you guys dug this, then make sure you hit the like button. And yeah, leave a comment down below and let me know what you guys think about this, because I love the older stories. Like I love going back, starting from the beginning and just working my way forward, because you just get this really cool, organic, progressive story about these different characters. But with that being said, guys, we're going to bring this video to an end and I will catch you all later. Peace.